Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program. My name is Selena Bemak, and I am the Programs and Communications Coordinator at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. HSP was founded in 1824, and we currently hold over 21 million manuscripts in our collections, with a particular emphasis on early American history, ethnic history, science and industry, the arts, and of course, genealogical research. Just a few housekeeping notes before tonight's program, Supreme Court Justice in Philadelphia, 1782 to 1829. We will have closed captions available for this program. So you can see there's auto transcription is enabled, and you'll see a little closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. It should be popping up now. Also, we will be recording tonight's program, and it will be sent to you in a follow-up email following this program, as well along with the survey. We also will have time for questions at the end, but if you think of questions, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat, as well as let us know where you are zooming in from. Thank you, Justina. And we are in webinar mode, which means we cannot see you and you cannot see each other. So again, if you would like to ask a question, you can put it in the chat. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or you can also raise your hand and we will take your question. So we are delighted here to host Gerard Magliocca, who will speak about his book, Washington's Heir, The Life of Justice Bushrod Washington. Gerard is the Samuel R. Rosen Professor at the Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law, and Washington's Heir is his fifth book on constitutional history. So tonight, Gerard will speak on Washington's Heir, which is the first published biography of Bushrod Washington, George Washington's nephew and Supreme Court Justice. Bushrod inherited Mount Vernon and served as Chief Justice John Marshall's right-hand man on the Supreme Court. This book provides an in-depth look at Bushrod's extraordinary life and career, and tonight Gerard will focus on Bushrod's time spent in Philadelphia. So without further ado, Gerard, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you, Selena. Thank you to everyone at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania for organizing this event, and also for helping me write this book, because without the materials in the Society's collection, this book would not have been possible. And I thank all of you who are in attendance, even though I can't see you. And this talk, I guess, like many virtual talks, will have a sort of Ken Burns-ish quality to it, in that you will be hearing me, but there will be quite a number of slides that will be showing you images of the various cast of characters, you might say, that are involved in this story. So, as Selena told you, as I share my screen to bring up slides, and I say start, there we go. Okay, so as Selena told you, my new book is about Bushrod Washington. And he is George Washington's nephew. He is the heir to Mount Vernon after Martha Washington's death, and lives at Mount Vernon for many years. He is also a Supreme Court justice for 30 years, from 1798 until 1829. Why did I decide to write a book about him? Well, first of all, no one else ever had, so that was one reason. Secondly, he brings a story of George Washington or a vantage point on George Washington that you wouldn't get from other points of view. So that was interesting to me. There is the judicial legal angle to it, because I am a law professor. So that's also something that is of interest to me. And I will talk about that a little bit tonight. And then also there are other aspects just of his personal life and his life at Mount Vernon that I found particularly interesting. So, now I'm going to show you, this is, of course, without the looming shadow of George over his shoulder. I'm going to focus in my talk tonight about Justice Washington's love affair with Philadelphia, which began when he was a young man and continued until he died in the city 40 years after his arrival. After his death, the Supreme Court held an official memorial for Justice Washington, and it was said there in his obituary or official, tribute that, quote, Justice Washington belonged to two states, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Now, he was from Virginia, so it's easy to see why that was included. But Pennsylvania was his adopted home. And that was true from his legal training through much of his judicial career and important personal relationships that he forged in the city. So I'm going to talk about that for about half or a little more than half of the talk. And then I'm also going to tell you about his most important case that he heard as a judge when he was in Philadelphia, which was in 1809, the case of United States versus Bright. Okay, so who was Bushrod Washington, sort of briefly? He was the eldest son of George Washington's younger brother, Jack. And Jack was the only sibling that George liked and confided in and trusted. And so, in a sense, it was logical that when Bushrod became an adult, George would take an interest in his career. And this is, in fact, what happened. Bushrod comes to Philadelphia as a 20-year-old in 1782. And this is really to pursue his legal education. Now, in those days, they didn't have law schools in the way that we do now, though Bushrod Washington did attend some law lectures at William and Mary when he was young. Basically, the way you became a lawyer was you served as an apprentice to a practicing lawyer. And Washington arrived in Philadelphia to serve as an apprentice to James Wilson, who was one of the founding fathers and probably one of the more underappreciated or underrated founding fathers. So Wilson was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was a major figure in the Constitutional Convention, later served on the Supreme Court, and was one of the 2 or 3 best lawyers in Pennsylvania. Bushrod got this apprenticeship through George's influence. George not only essentially wrote to Wilson asking him to take Bushrod under his wing, but also agreed to pay Wilson's fee for Bushrod's apprenticeship, which was a rather large sum. Indeed, some have described it as a princely sum. It seems as though George did this largely as a favor to his brother, because he had no relationship with Bushrod Washington before Bushrod arrived in Philadelphia. I mean, largely because George was off fighting in the Revolutionary War and leading the Revolutionary War while Bushrod was still a teenager and sort of, just coming of age. But in addition to arranging this apprenticeship, George introduced Bushrod to all of the notable people in the city at the time, which of course was serving as the national capital in 1782. Now, just to go back to James Wilson for a moment, we don't really know much about what Bushrod Washington did as a legal apprentice. I mean, each lawyer could sort of decide for himself what the apprentice did or saw. So we don't have much of a sense of whether Wilson had any real influence over Washington's subsequent intellectual development. We do know, though, that Bushrod, formed what proved to be probably one of the most important non-family relationships in his life with Elizabeth Powell. Her full name was Elizabeth Willing Powell. And she was a quite remarkable person about whom I knew very little before I began the research on this project. Sometimes research on books like this takes you in unexpected directions, and I think this was one of them. So let me tell you a little bit about Eliza Powell, because she's a major figure in the life of the city in this period. So she was the daughter of the mayor of Philadelphia, and then later she married Samuel Powell, who became the mayor of Philadelphia. More important, she was a person who discussed politics regularly with many of the founding fathers, especially George Washington. She was a close personal friend of George and Martha Washington. And indeed, George Washington's biographers say that Eliza Powell is the only woman that we know of that he talked politics with regularly and saw her as kind of an intellectual equal. One famous example of this is that when George Washington was at the end of his first term as president, he was thinking about retiring because he was quite fed up with all of the criticism that he was receiving and all of the infighting in the cabinet between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. And Eliza Powell wrote him a letter, a lengthy letter explaining why she thought that would be a mistake and why he really did need to run for a second term. We can't say directly whether that was the thing that convinced him, but it was a pretty convincing argument that she made. Now, Powell and her husband lived in a home which is still standing today, Powell House. Some of you may have been there. And Powell House was a kind of salon for intellectual life in Philadelphia throughout the 1780s. During the Constitutional Convention, many of the delegates would socialize there during breaks in the proceedings. And in the time that Bushrod was there, he was a frequent visitor at the home of the Powells and was really kind of taken under their wing. In a sense, Eliza Powell served as a kind of surrogate mother for Washington while he was in the city. Now, I should mention parenthetically that Eliza Powell is perhaps most famous today because she allegedly was the person who had the conversation with Benjamin Franklin at the end of the Constitutional Convention, where she asked Dr. Franklin, "What have you given us?" And he responded, "A republic if you can keep it." That's a very famous line. Now, of course, later when she was asked about this, she said she actually didn't recall this incident at all. But in effect, she sort of said something like, well, it's too good of a story to ruin. So, why deny that it occurred? Anyway, now, at Powell House or throughout Philadelphia in the period that Bushrod was serving as an apprentice, it was a very optimistic, kind of carefree time because the Revolutionary War was not formally over, but it was for all practical purposes over. The war had been long and difficult. Philadelphia had been occupied by British troops for a period of time. And there was a sense of joy that that was over and a kind of idea that people wanted to have fun and enjoy themselves. And that took the form of lots of social gatherings. There are a lot of notes in letters that Bushrod wrote, especially to his mother, where he would talk about dances that he went to, social dances where they did the minuet or formal teas, playing chess. And these were things where the Powells were involved, George Washington was involved, and other sort of leading families in the city were kind of the frequent sort of social guests or social partners in these activities. And many of them would have been centered at Powell House. So this portrait of Bushrod, which I began with, was painted when he was 21 and was an apprentice. So hence he's holding the book, right? And it's also got him in a sort of formal, you might say lawyerly garb here. One thing I should note is that Bushrod Washington doesn't really look at all like his uncle. He was a short man and not particularly athletic. That was just a different strain of the Washington family, you might say, or the genes of the Washington family. Anyway, we have a letter that Bushrod wrote to his mother, basically explaining that the artist for this portrait was one that the Powells helped him pick out. And that when he saw this portrait for the first time, he was a little disappointed. And he said, quote, that it thought his expression borders on austerity rather than intense meditation, that it made him look too severe or too serious, but that Eliza Powell had sort of reassured him that his expression was not an ill-natured one, but rather a mixture of thought and pensiveness, which she said was often how he looked when he was concentrating. And then she sort of added in kind of her playful way that, well, you have a very high opinion of yourself and you must think yourself a perfect Adonis. So maybe that's why, you're disappointed with how the portrait turned out. And of course, he then wrote his mother that he was sort of blushed when she said that, but then they all laughed because she realized it was a joke. Now, Now, the bond that Bushrod Washington and Eliza Powell forged during this apprenticeship continued after he returned to Virginia in 1784 to become a lawyer. We have a delightful letter from Eliza where, after a period of time where he had not written her back, she wrote a letter and she sent him a pair of gloves that she had made. And she said, "Oh, I think perhaps you haven't written me because your hands are cold from the winter weather. So I'm sending you a pair of gloves. So then, you'll be able to write me." So that was sort of a charming way of saying, hey, you haven't written me for a while. Why not? This is a letter. Actually, it's not the specific letter that I just referred to, but it is a letter in the collection of the society of Eliza Powell to Bushrod Washington. People in some ways had needed much better penmanship in those days when all correspondence had to be by letter. Now, one reason that Bushrod may not have written Eliza Powell as often as she would have liked when he left the city was that he was, in fact, courting his future wife, Nancy Blackburn, whom he married in 1785. Her father had been an officer in George Washington's army and was part of a sort of distinguished Virginia family. Bushrod and Nancy had no children, but they did end up raising many of their nieces and nephews because all of Bushrod's siblings died young, and a couple of her siblings also died young and left children that they cared for. It's a little ironic because George and Martha Washington, as you may know, also had no children of their own, but did end up caring for many either stepchildren or other family relatives who, had no one to care for them after their parents had died. Okay, so Bushrod is a lawyer in Virginia. He is involved also in state politics. He gets elected in particular to the ratifying convention for the Constitution in Virginia, which is held in 1788. Bushrod is a strong supporter of the Constitution, probably not surprising given his uncle's role in the Constitutional Convention. When Eliza Powell learns of this, she sends Bushrod copies of essays that James Wilson had written or speeches that James Wilson had given in support of the Constitution, both in Pennsylvania and then in the Pennsylvania ratifying convention, basically with the thought that this would help Bushrod prepare for the Virginia convention. Bushrod supports the Constitution. He kind of works more behind the scenes in that body to support the Federalists while he's writing letters to George Washington, sort of keeping him up to date on what's going on, because George himself did not attend the convention, decided to sort of be neutral. Over the next 10 years, Bushrod becomes one of the top lawyers in Virginia. And in 1798, he is appointed to the Supreme Court by John Adams. And of course, the Supreme Court at that time is meeting in Philadelphia when it has its sessions. And so he arrives in Philadelphia in January of 1799 for the first time since his apprenticeship had ended to take his seat on the Supreme Court. Now, in honor of that sort of occasion, Eliza Powell bought him his robe, his judicial robe, a black satin robe as a gift, and presumably was, might have been in attendance even in the initial session. Now, when Bushrod is in Philadelphia as a justice, of course, he's not living there permanently. He basically stays in boarding houses. We know some of the boarding houses he stayed in, or at least where they were. I mean, the first one he was at was on North 3rd Street. Obviously, the capital then moves to Washington, D.C., right, at the end of 1800, which means the Supreme Court is no longer in Philadelphia. I should mention, this is where the Supreme Court met in Philadelphia. This is adjacent to Independence Hall. This is City Hall. which was the home of the Supreme Court from 1790 to 1800. Okay, so when the Supreme Court moves to Washington, D.C., though, that is not the end of Bushrod's work in Philadelphia. And to understand why, I have to explain sort of that in those days, Supreme Court justices spent most of their time actually not on the Supreme Court. So there were very few federal judges. And one way that they sort of handled cases was to have Supreme Court justices go around the country to different sections and hold trials and hear appeals in concert with the judges that were sort of permanently sort of positioned in these places. It was called circuit riding. And when the circuit riding system was reformed in 1802, the justices were given different geographic assignments for their circuits, and Bushrod was given Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Now, it's hard not to imagine that he asked for that because of his sort of training in Philadelphia and his relationships in the city. That is, to some degree, he was a good friend and close colleague of John Marshall. And John Marshall got to pick Virginia as his circuit because it was close to home and he didn't have to travel, which was a big advantage. But Bushrod probably got his pick of what else could be taken as a circuit assignment. By picking this circuit assignment in Philadelphia and New Jersey, it meant that each year Bushrod would come to Philadelphia and stay for somewhere between 1 or 2 months at a time to hear cases. Sometimes he was in Trenton if the cases were in New Jersey, but it was far more common for him to be in Philadelphia. Now, this was, of course, delightful because he loved Philadelphia. He had friends in Philadelphia. Indeed, Eliza Powell even loaned him money to buy furniture at Mount Vernon in 1802 when Bushrod Washington sort of moved into Mount Vernon because there's nothing in the house at that point. All of it had been basically taken or sold off by Martha Washington's heirs, and he needed a loan. And so she gave him a loan. And when he was in the city for all the remainder of his life, he would dine with Eliza Powell every Sunday. He would dine with Eliza Powell every Sunday at her home. By this point, she was a widow. And we have some recollections of the kinds of sort of social interactions that they had from Liza Powell's niece. Liza Powell also had no children who lived to adulthood. So in some sense, Bushrod was something like a surrogate son for her, I think, though she had other blood relatives. I particularly like this portrait, by the way, because it's unfinished, right? But the unfinished, it has a sort of dynamic quality to it, I think. Like she seems a little more alive because of its unfinished nature than other more stiff, formal portraits of her that I have seen. Now, one thing I should mention about Liza Powell, which is probably of interest to some of you, is that she was an abolitionist with respect to slavery. She didn't hold this opinion for her entire life, but she did come to it later in life. And that's, of course, very interesting because Bushrod Washington was a slave owner for his entire life. And it's interesting that we have no real documentation about it as to what kind of conversations did they have about that, if they had them at all, during their weekly dinners when he was visiting Philadelphia. Eliza Powell and Bushrod Washington died within about 6 months of each other. So their relationship ran very deep, but whether it extended to that or sort of that was a subject they sort of decided not to discuss, we really don't know. But it does show that Washington's time in Philadelphia exposed him to views that most Southerners didn't get to experience because they never really went to the North or went to areas where slavery was not permitted. Okay, now, in these circuit courts that Bushrod held, they were a little awkward by modern standards in that a trial was held by two judges. One of them was a federal district judge, and the one that Bushrod sat with most often was Richard Peters, who was appointed to the bench by George Washington and served until a few years before Bushrod's death. Peters was a Federalist. He was a kind of bon vivant who wrote really, well, lively, sometimes vulgar letters on all manner of things. But when he and Washington sat together, it meant there were two judges running the trial. Now, in practice, the justice tended to run the trial, in part just because he was a justice and Judge Peters was not, but also probably because Washington was somewhat keener mind and probably more interested in kind of making the trial run well than some of his other colleagues were. Now, the circuit court at this time met in Congress Hall, which was, again, not very far from Independence Hall or City Hall. It was actually a place where Congress met during the time that the national capital was in Philadelphia, hence the name, right? But then after the capital relocated, they kind of converted where Congress had met into a courtroom. Now, Nancy Washington would usually accompany Bushrod to Philadelphia, not every year, but most years. She suffered from ill health much of her life. Trying to reconstruct the medical condition of someone from 200 years ago is very difficult, especially with respect to women who were often sort of misdiagnosed or diagnosed with these sort of very general terms like hysteria, and nobody really knows what that was supposed to mean. From what we can gather, she seemed to have a kind of anxiety type disorder. And one way of knowing that is that one of the lawyers who practiced in the circuit court regularly and wrote a memoir said that Washington told him that I have to end court at exactly 3 o'clock and get home to wherever we're staying, whatever boarding house we're staying at, because if I don't, my wife becomes very frightened that something happened to me. And so I can't be late. This is one of some tidbit, one of the many tidbits of information we have about Nancy Washington that would suggest that she had some sort of either depression or anxiety disorder. Nevertheless, she was, by all accounts, a very sociable person. She loved music, and she was, as I said, regular kind of attendee with Bushrod when he was in the city. Okay, now, there are many cases that Justice Washington did in Philadelphia, either as a trial judge or as an appellate judge, but I'm going to just talk about one in the interest of time, and it's also the most important one that he decided during his time there, and that was United States versus Bright. And this was kind of like the trial of the century. I guess every city, you might say, has 5 or 10 trials of the century, every century, in the sense that it captivated the city in 1809. So briefly, this case involved a British warship, the Active, which was captured during the Revolutionary War. And there was a dispute about who was entitled to the money from selling the ship, as well as all of what the goods that were on it. And the dispute was between the state of Pennsylvania and some private individuals who had, it's actually a very exciting story. They were prisoners on this ship, and they managed to sort of break out of their confinement and take over the ship and then sail it towards Philadelphia, where it was met at some point by a Pennsylvania ship. And hence there was the dispute. The Pennsylvania said, well, we captured it because we were the ones who intercepted it. And the people who had taken control of the Active said, no, we're entitled to it because we're the ones who wrested control of the ship from the British. All right. The Continental Congress set up a special committee to look into this, and the committee decided that the individuals on the ship really were entitled to the money. Now, of course, remember, this is during the Revolutionary War. There are no federal courts, and states have a lot more authority to basically reject decisions of the national government. So Pennsylvania responded by saying, look, we don't agree with this committee's decision. We're not going to give them the money. So a compromise was worked out where the money, the ship was sold, all the goods were sold, the money was given to David Rittenhouse, who was the treasurer of Pennsylvania, also a noted scientist. I'm sure many of you are very familiar not only with Rittenhouse Square, but also, just other things that he did. Obviously, he's got his telescope here in this image. Okay, so then the money was put in escrow under his sort of stewardship until sometime later when the dispute could be worked out. Okay, now, of course, as with many legal cases, this meant decades of wrangling. And indeed, about 20 years later, one of the individuals who had been aboard the Active brought a federal lawsuit trying to get the money. The money was now in the possession of Rittenhouse's heirs because Rittenhouse had passed away. Okay, so Judge Peters, who was the district court judge, issued an opinion saying that, yes, these individuals were entitled to the money like the Continental Congress had said, and Pennsylvania had to release the money from the escrow. The state legislature, though, disagreed and passed a law that said that the federal court order by Judge Peters could not be obeyed, and that it should not be obeyed. And that's pretty serious stuff. An appeal was taken to the Supreme Court, and a unanimous opinion by Chief Justice Marshall, which Justice Washington joined, the Supreme Court said, no, a state legislature cannot defy a federal court order. So Judge Peters then said, okay, I'm going to order federal marshals to go to get the money. And the heirs of David Rittenhouse were now living on 7th and Arch Street. When the marshals got there, though, they found that there were state troops that were in front of the house that would not allow them to enter. The troops had been put there by Governor Simon Snyder, who in part thought he was carrying out the wishes of the state legislature in defying the order, but also he rejected the authority of the Supreme Court to say that, in effect, a federal judge's order had to prevail over what the state of Pennsylvania's position had been since the Revolutionary War about this money not belonging to the individuals who had taken over the Active. Okay, so the governor had the state militia under the command of a man named Michael Bright basically say that the federal marshals cannot enter this house. The federal marshals responded by summoning a posse, almost like normally we think of a posse as being something from the Old West, but in those days, that's how you would raise a force to try to execute the law. The marshals gathered 2,000 people to confront the state militia. Now, this is a very explosive situation. People in the city are not sure if this is going to lead to violence or just outright civil strife. The governor responded by writing to President Madison, who had just assumed office, and said that, look, you need to back down. This money doesn't belong to these individuals, and the federal court order is wrong, and we are within our prerogatives to resist this federal authority. Okay, now Madison, in what is a kind of unappreciated decision, refused to back down and told the governor basically, no, you have to back down. So with that, the governor did back down. He ordered the state militia to withdraw, and the federal marshals were able to take the money from the home and give it to those who rightfully had it under, the federal court order. This is interesting because, when we think about conflicts between the federal government and the states during the period before the Civil War, we almost always think about the South, right? We think about South Carolina, or we think about, slave owners. And of course, most of those conflicts were between Southern states and the national government, but not all of them. And indeed, this one in Pennsylvania was probably the first one to really rise to the level of a Supreme Court opinion, presidential involvement, potential violence, because it just sort of was a sore point, going back to Revolutionary War days, as to what the proper relationship should be between the federal government and the states. Okay, now what follows from this? Well, there is a criminal indictment brought against General Bright and some of the officers in the state militia, basically charging them with obstruction of justice because they had obstructed the federal marshals in executing the court order. And then the trial is held in 1809. And again, when I say trial of the century, I'm saying, okay, it was one of those trials where everybody wanted to be in a courtroom, everybody was talking about it, people weren't sure what was going to happen, because of course, it was one thing for the governor to back down in terms of the use of force. It was something else to say, would a jury convict General Bright and these other state military officials of a federal crime? Now, when the Bright trial was going on, Justice Washington actually was in Philadelphia by himself. Nancy didn't come with him on that particular trip. So we have actually a letter that he wrote to her talking about how things were going. And he explained that basically he was getting up at 5 a.m, getting ready for work before dawn, and he was working until 11 or 12 at night because this was such an important case, and he wanted to make sure that every I was dotted and T was crossed to make sure that people thought justice was done. Now, the trial was somewhat complicated, but I will single out one argument that General Bright and his fellow officers made in their defense. And it was that, well, we were just following orders. We had orders from the governor. We were following them. That can't be a crime. Now, if that sounds familiar, it should, because it's basically the same argument that various Nazi officials made in the Nuremberg trials after World War II, right? And just as those arguments were rejected then, they were rejected by Justice Washington. So in talking to the jury, in the summation of the case, Washington described this sort of defense as, the doctrine appears to us monstrous, the consequences of it terrible, right? And he basically explained that, look, military officials cannot follow illegal orders, and that the orders that were given by the governor to defy a Supreme Court opinion and a federal court order were clearly illegal. And so that was not a defense against this criminal charge. Now, what's interesting is the way this trial comes out kind of gives you an example, which in some ways is maybe an instructive example of how to diffuse a tense situation, right? So what happens? The jury goes back and they return and say, well, everything that General Bright and the officers are accused of, we agree that they did them. But we would like to leave it to the court to decide whether that means they're guilty of a crime. So in other words, they didn't say they were not guilty, right? And they didn't sort of say it didn't happen. They just didn't want to say, as Pennsylvanians, that their fellow Pennsylvanians were in fact guilty, even though they knew that by saying that General Bright and his fellow officers had in fact obstructed the federal court order, that Well, that meant they were guilty. Okay, so Justice Washington took this cue and he declared them guilty and pronounced sentence, which was basically like a month in prison and a fine. After sentence was pronounced, President Madison gave the officers a pardon. In other words, okay, the rule of law was vindicated by this guilty verdict, right? But mercy was shown because it was in no one's interest to actually put them in prison. It was a compromise. So it's kind of connects to a larger theme in the book, which is that, sometimes judging is the exercise of wisdom, not just the exercise of intellect. And wisdom doesn't always, work in a fully logically consistent way, but that doesn't mean that the logically consistent way is the better way. What you see here is a portrait of Justice Washington as an old man, painted actually by another Philadelphian, sort of towards the end of his life. Washington died in Philadelphia in 1829 while on circuit court. And Nancy, his wife, was with him. They took the body back to Mount Vernon for burial, and she died 2 or 3 days after his death. You could say it was grief, broken heart, coincidence, however you want to put it, but it's a kind of almost, truth is stranger than fiction, right? And then this is maybe an example of that. So in a way, you could say she also died in Philadelphia. And with that, I think I will stop and invite your questions. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gerard. That was great. So we do have a few questions. So the first question I'm seeing is from the Q&A, and it is from Gus from Bluebell, Pennsylvania. And, Gus asks, where does Lund Washington fit into the Washington family, fit in with the Washington family?
Okay, so not a direct relative of Bushrod, right? So it's a different branch of the family. I mean, George had many siblings, and there were many nephews and nieces and whatnot. So not much of a relationship between Lind and Bushrod. Now, and I should add, because I get this question a lot, and I didn't mention it in the talk. Bushrod, that's a strange name. Where did he get that from? And the answer is it was his mother's maiden name. So in case any of you were wondering, his mother was Hannah Bushrod before her marriage, and that's why her eldest son was named Bushrod.
Great. Another question from the chat is, there's 2 questions actually. The first is, was this the first time a state legislature tried to pass a law obstructing the implementation of a Supreme Court decision?
Yes, in terms of actually then having it backed up by force, right? So, I mean, there were more symbolic state legislative actions that you could point to. And there were also state legislatures that passed resolutions condemning, say, a federal law rather than a court order. But yes, this is the first notable example we have of an attempt to defy a federal court order coming from a state legislature. Now, note, that's a little different than saying, in effect, what's a relationship between state courts and federal courts? That's something that gets taken up in this period as well, but in different cases.
So the follow-up to that is, did this case set a precedent?
Well, it did, because first of all, the Supreme Court's opinion, which was then, Supreme Court opinions set precedents, but they have to be backed up. So the Supreme Court opinion set the precedent that, look, in effect, it's not for legislatures to obstruct court orders, right? They're different functions, I mean, separation of powers, and that one is more of a political act, the other is an act, in support of the rule of law, so that, a court order, you have to go through the regular process of appeal to the courts to get it overturned. Okay, now the thing is, though, the Supreme Court opinion would have not meant much had, first of all, President Madison not told the governor of Pennsylvania to stand down when he tried to use force to obstruct the execution of that opinion. And secondly, in some sense, there had to be some follow-up to that, even if it was only more symbolic, in the conviction of Bright and the others, and the rejection of the argument that just because a state governor told me to obstruct the law means I can obstruct the law. So all of that sort of together can be understood as a precedent. And it's worth pointing out that Washington's summation of the case to the jury has a lot of passages in it that are very much reminiscent of things you see in opinions by John Marshall for the Supreme Court in this period, in this era where he's trying to establish national authority as against state encroachments by the states. And, you know, we don't know exactly how much Marshall was borrowing from Washington or Washington was borrowing from Marshall. I mean, they worked together on very closely. So in some sense, a bit like saying, you know, well, did Paul McCartney do it? Did John Lennon do it? You know, I mean, it's like, it's a partnership. But there is a certain amount that was drawn upon from those cases than in subsequent cases about federal and state power contests.
And of course, Marshall is more remembered as this is just the first biography on Bushrod. So another question comes from our Q&A from Jay, who would like you to comment on Bushrod's role in the American Colonization Society and the criticism he received for not freeing his slaves and those he received from George Washington.
Right. So first is, you know, George Washington, as many of you know, freed his enslaved people in his will. So when Bushrod arrives at Mount Vernon to take over his inheritance after Martha Washington dies, there are no enslaved people there. There are only free blacks, those who had been enslaved, who decided to stay, mostly elderly or children. Bushrod brings his own enslaved people there and reestablishes slavery at Mount Vernon. Now, it is also true that he ran as, in some sense, a ceremonial role, but he was president of the American Colonization Society. And the Colonization Society was an organization which was established to basically create a free Black colony in Liberia that would be a place to which free Blacks or freed slaves could go. Now, the question is, you know, all right, but what was the point of that, right? Was it to help get people freed from slavery? Was it to get rid of Black people from the United States? Some people had one view of it, some people had a different view of it. And it was not a particularly effective organization, and in some sense, because its whole rationale was kind of incoherent. You know, Bushrod was criticized during his lifetime, probably more so publicly than almost anyone else of that era who was in some significant governmental position, for his ownership of enslaved people and his refusal to free them, and that he bought and sold. And, you know, part of his answer to some degree was kind of, well, just because my uncle freed his enslaved people doesn't mean that I have to, you know, which of course isn't, it's sort of like, yeah, but that's not really, doesn't really answer the question. It's, you know, the role that he had in slavery was complex in the sense that as a judge, and I talk about this in a chapter that's focused more on the cases that the other cases that he did in Philadelphia, he did have fugitive slave cases before him because there were people who had escaped to Pennsylvania to be free. And every time that happened, he sided with the enslaved person and against the slave owner, which, you know, is kind of interesting just in the sense of, okay, well, he did follow the law, you know, when it came before him. Now, in contrast to that, there was, and he did make noises from time to time about wanting to do something about slavery, but then did he really do anything about slavery in his own private capacity? No, not at all. So, that's, I mean, I think some of that might be attributable, some of this mixed picture might be the fact that he spent so much time, half of his time in a slave state, half of his time in a free state. And so the fact that he was in Philadelphia, kind of exposed him to a different set of ideas than he would have had if he just been in Virginia. But it didn't convert him into an abolitionist the way Eliza Powell was, or any kind of reformer with more kind of a crusading kind of spirit.
Interesting. We have another question in the chat. What is actually a three-part question. When did the Supreme Court stop using jury trials to make decisions? This is the first part. Was it the same time that they stopped writing circuits? And the last part is, and how were the juries chosen?
Okay, so the Supreme Court only did a few jury trials kind of early on in the 1790s. And then that was about it, because it proved to be very cumbersome. If you think about it, if it's bad having two judges run a trial, imagine trying to have 6 or 7, or 9 run a trial, right? It would be kind of impossible. So they quickly realized that wasn't going to work. The circuit system, though, continued for about 100 years after the foundation of the, after the ratification of the Constitution. It was only really in the 1890s or so that it kind of petered out. I mean, to some degree, there were more and more federal judges. There was less and less of a need to have the justices go do circuit riding. They didn't like it because they didn't like traveling. So eventually we got to a point where it really was only there in kind of informally, but not in practice. So, and then it was formally abolished. I mean, technically, even now, Supreme Court justices are assigned to different circuits. It's just that they don't really do much of anything in that role anymore. And then the last question was, how were juries picked? Well, okay, that of course differed quite a bit from place to place. But basically, not that much different than how they're picked now, except that the pool of people from whom juries can be picked is much broader and more representative now than it was then. But the actual method, not that much different. I mean, except that you wouldn't have had the same record keeping, detail that you have now.
No. So we have another question in the chat. This is about Bushrod and his wife. And this person wants to know, what did their wills provide for the disposition of their slaves? Right.
So they, of course, there was this weird thing that, in a sense, that they both died almost simultaneously, which meant that, neither one got the other stuff, really. It just went to their director. So their heirs was their own, Bushrod's own nephew and niece. Actually, her niece married his nephew. So, Gaul stayed in the family. And basically it all went to them. The only exception, which we could talk about a little bit, is for, there were no exceptions. There was one former enslaved person who was freed by Bushrod many years earlier, whom now scholars believe to have been Washington by blood. That is, he was almost certainly the son of either Bushrod, one of his 2 siblings, or Bushrod's father. Though we have no way to know which of the 4 we would have been. But his name was West Ford, and he was a free Black who then was a legatee of Bushrod's will. He inherited about, more than 100 acres of land from Mount Vernon. He's the only Black to be given anything in Bushrod's will. So that is also further evidence people point to that he must have been a family member, among other things that can lead to that conclusion. All of their enslaved people were inherited by their heirs, their niece and nephew. And none of them were freed.
Good to know. So I just have one question if there are no other questions in the chat or Q&A. So when the Supreme Court is still held in session in Philadelphia, in Old City Hall, and Bushrod's there, and George Washington dies in 1799, are they currently in session at that point? And does Bushrod have to return to Mount Vernon, or is he not in Philadelphia? If you know.
Bushrod, okay, so Bushrod did not attend George Washington's funeral. And he was not in Philadelphia when George Washington died because the court didn't meet in December. And George Washington died in December. He was, though, I believe, on circuit somewhere else, because prior to 1802, he went to a couple of different cities to do the circuit. It hadn't been kind of set in stone that he was going only to Philadelphia and Trenton. So no, he was not able to get to Mount Vernon for the funeral, but he was not in Philadelphia then either.
All right, well, Jake, thank you, Gerard. I think we are just about out of time. It's almost 7:30. A big thank you to everyone for attending tonight, especially our members. We are very grateful for you and for your support to keep us going here at HSP to put on programs like this. If you would like to purchase Gerard's book or sign up for our newsletter, I'm putting both links in the chat right now. The first is to purchase Gerard's book, Washington's Heir, and the second is to sign up for HSP's newsletter. We send out a monthly newsletter so you can stay up to date with what's happening on over here. But other than that, have a great Wednesday night, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.